Good day. Today is Saturday, 25th October 2025. And before I start with this video, let me remind you again to tick the like button if once you've watched the video, you like the video and you want to indicate that fact. Perhaps you might also, by the way, want to check your subscription to this channel also. Anyway, let me proceed now with the topic under discussion, which again is going to be mostly about Ukraine, though I do intend to touch on some other matters as well. Briefly, we are still in the aftermath of what I consider to be a diplomatic debacle, the one that took place over the course of the last 10 days, where the United States, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, apparently on the brink of making a decision to deploy Tomahawk missiles in Ukraine, had a telephone conversation with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, suggested to the President of Russia that they meet at some point in the next few weeks in Budapest, got the Russian president with some reluctance, if not exactly to agree, to at least say that he was open to the possibility, only for the President of the United States to reverse his position a few days later, announced that he was calling the whole summit meeting off, and then declared that he was going to impose, for the first time since he was inaugurated, sanctions against Russia, to be precise, against the two big Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. And as I've discussed already, all of these various moves have been taken very badly in Moscow. They have been seen there as a sign of extraordinary bad faith. The president's announcement that he was calling off the summit and imposing the sanctions because the Russians were refusing to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine has gone down particularly badly, given that the president himself, over the course of his meeting with Putin in Alaska, agreed that a temporary ceasefire was a bad idea and that the parties should move forwards to a permanent negotiated resolution of the crisis. And, well, suffice to say that there are many people in Russia who are treating the president's reversal on this one thing that he publicly agreed with Putin about when they met in Alaska as essentially a betrayal. And I understand that this has cut through to the wider Russian public. Maybe they're not following in great detail all the permutations of the diplomacy. Perhaps they would take the cancellation of a summit meeting, which had never been formally agreed to, in their stride. But the fact that the president agreed something with their president in August and then reversed himself without explanation and imposed sanctions against their country in October, that has cut through and apparently is being talked about and discussed on Russian social media, which I should stress I myself don't spend time checking out on. But anyway, I've heard that this has cut through and it has been noticed by the wider public in Russia, and it is having a negative effect, a very negative effect, about the whole idea of improving relations with the United States amongst the broader Russian public, some of whom have always been skeptical, but the majority of whom have undoubtedly been open to the idea up to now. Anyway, I don't know to what extent this very strong negative reaction in Russia has been fully understood in the United States. What I would say is that I've been reading commentaries in two Russian newspapers, Izvestia and Vedomosti, and these commentaries, which quote a succession of different Russian experts, do make one important point, which is that the sanctions that the president announced, even though they are seen in Russia as a deeply unfriendly act, are not for the Russians a matter of extreme concern. They do not cross any Russian red lines. The Russians don't believe that these sanctions are going to be effective in the long term. I have no doubt, as I've discussed in several programs already, that about this they are right. Besides, the Russians by now have become very accustomed to the United States imposing sanctions upon them. They probably expected that Donald Trump sooner or later would impose these sanctions. However, deploying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine absolutely would have crossed a Russian red line. Launching missile strikes into Russia violates a Russian red line, and this was made clear by the Russians last year. As I've said in recent programs, Putin let it pass when it happened in November last year and for some weeks thereafter, but he did so at that time because he expected that Donald Trump would put a stop to the practice and did not want to jeopardize his prospects of coming to some kind of understanding with Trump before Trump actually became president, but after the presidential election last year. But the Russians are now making it very clear now that the red line does indeed still apply. Deploying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would emphatically cross it, and that the Russians would certainly respond. And yesterday I discussed how Putin has said that if there were missile strikes on Russia using Tomahawks, there would be, or long-range missiles in fact, there would be an overwhelming response from the Russians. And his words were then followed up by his spokesman, Peskov, who also said that the Russian response would be enormous, overwhelming, or some such word. So the Russians are making this distinction. They're saying that the sanctions, deeply unfriendly and negative a step as they are, do not cross any Russian red lines. Deployments of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, or indeed long-range missile strikes from the territory of Ukraine into Russia, or indeed from anywhere into Russia, absolutely do cross Russian red lines, and they're at least making that clear. Now, someone in the United States, I suspect, even if they don't have a full grasp of the damage that has been done over the last 2 weeks, does at least have some inkling that some harm has been done, and does seem to be trying to retrieve the situation in some respect. And we can see this because somewhat unexpectedly, the head of Russia's direct investment fund, Kirill Dmitriev, has traveled to Washington, where he is meeting with Witkoff and apparently other people in the United States who have not been named, or at least not named by him. We know that one of these people is Representative Luna, who has been making all kinds of comments recently, which shows that she at least does seem to understand some of the problems and some of the enormous risks that are piling up. It may be, and Dmitriev implies, that there are other people who he's going to be meeting whilst in Washington as well. And of course, he has also been going on to the television studios and giving interviews. And of course, he obtained much of his education in the United States. He studied at Harvard for a time, but I believe he's been to another American university as well, and he speaks fluent English. And unlike most Russian officials, he is therefore able to explain things to an American audience in their own language, to a great extent overcoming the language barrier, which is a major problem for the Russians in getting their message across to the wider public in the United States. Now, Dmitriev's visit is interesting because apparently it was already prepared some time ago. Dmitriev has said that it was a scheduled visit, the dates from that was agreed some time ago. It's perhaps worth pointing out that Dmitriev himself is under US sanctions. So the United States has to waive the sanctions against him to enable him to come to the United States. And of course, he also needs a US visa, obviously, in order to be able to go to the United States. And the fact that the sanctions have been waived, and the fact that he's got the visa, and the fact that he's going at all, strongly suggests, in fact, I don't have any doubt about it, that he has been asked to come to the United States by some important people in the United States. The initiative, in other words, for him to come is coming from the United States, from the American side rather than the Russian. He has not been sent to the United States by Putin. It is the Americans who want him to come. And that is logical. If somebody in Washington is trying to repair the damage, that is what you would expect. Witkoff and Dmitriev have been the back channel. Neither is exactly an official of the American or Russian government. Dmitriev heads the Russian Direct Investment Fund, which is what the British refer to as a next step agency. Publicly owned, government controlled, but not part of the government structure itself. And, well, what exactly Witkoff's position is has never been clarified. He's obviously not just a private individual. He has some role within the United States government. But as far as I can tell, he does not have a senior position within the US bureaucracy. Now, that, by the way, is not unusual. It is often the case that the United States and previously the Soviet Union, and nowadays the United States and Russia, try to keep some kind of diplomatic and other contacts going with each other through informal envoys or through back channels. President Kennedy and President Nixon did this extensively. And by the way, during the Second World War, so did President Roosevelt. He used his friend Harry Hopkins to conduct a lot of his private diplomacy with the Russians at that time. Just saying. So this is not unprecedented. And as I said, somebody in the United States has made the decision to keep the back channel going and to continue to maintain contacts with the Russians. Somebody in the United States is also going out of their way over the last couple of hours to place the blame for the breakdown on the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And articles have appeared in the American media saying that it was Rubio who is supposedly now exercising dominating influence on the conduct of the US government, of the US government's foreign policy. He is, after all, simultaneously President Trump's Secretary of State and his national security advisor. This is supposed to be a temporary arrangement, by the way, after Mike Waltz lost his job as national security advisor. But if it is temporary, it is one of those temporary arrangements that goes on and which appears to be becoming permanent. Anyway, it's been suggested that it is Marco Rubio who has a well-established record as a man of strong neocon views. That was certainly the stance he had when he was a member of the Senate, that it was Rubio who decided that he would wreck the entire process leading up to the proposed summit meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest, and who presumably advocated the sudden imposition of the sanctions. Now, as to the sanctions themselves, there are a number of narratives also circulating, which are probably true. The media in the United States, and by the way in Britain also, is claiming that various people in the US government, in the administration, including apparently in the White House, were completely taken by surprise when the sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft were announced. In other words, this has not been discussed extensively, or indeed at all, within the highest levels of the United States government. And the Russians, for their part, are claiming that these sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft, were drawn up during the time of the Biden administration. They were drawn up by the Treasury Department that administers sanctions at that time. The intention apparently being to announce these sanctions after Kamala Harris won the presidential election last November. When Kamala Harris failed to win the election, the sanctions were shelved, but the work on them had been done, and the plan for them still was kept, and it was lying around in the Treasury Department until over the last couple of days, after the decision was made to call off the summit. Somebody took the decision. Somebody, Rubio, Trump, Bessent, who knows whom, took the decision to dust these sanctions out and to announce them in public. And no doubt this explains why Dmitriev is telling the administration in Washington, telling the people he's meeting in Washington, going on to the American media and telling the media that the Trump administration is at serious risk of falling into the same traps as the Biden administration did, of replicating the Biden administration's failed and erroneous policies. And of course, what he's basically saying, and what no doubt he's touching on, is that the administration is now following the Biden administration copybook on sanctions. Now, of course, I don't know whether this is true. I don't know how the Russians have got this information. Maybe somebody in the United States, maybe somebody in the administration has told them that. Maybe Witkoff said that to Dmitriev over the course of their many meetings, that there were these sanctions there in the background, and that there was always a risk or a chance that they might be dusted out and applied if the Russians didn't make concessions. Who knows? But anyway, that is the story that is circulating in Moscow, and the story in Washington, which is also being circulated at the present time, is, as I said, that there were some people in Washington who didn't realize, who didn't know that this sanctions announcement was coming, and who were taken by surprise by it. Now, obviously, Dmitriev is in Washington, and he's been having his meetings, and he's going to continue to have his meetings with various people in the United States, and there continues to be dialogue. And the Russians say that so far, despite the enormous damage done, at least no actual Russian red lines were crossed. At least there have not yet been long-range missile strikes against Russia. I will come to that in a moment, because there is actually a question mark over this. But anyway, that is what the Russians are saying, and because that red line has so far not been crossed, it is still possible to conduct the dialogue in the way that is being done. But it remains the case that there has been massive damage, that there's been enormous breakdown of trust, certainly on the Russian side, towards the United States. Medvedev has made it absolutely clear what he thinks, and there is no doubt at all, to my mind, that he speaks for a very, very powerful and increasing group of people within the Russian leadership, that there should be no illusions about Donald Trump, that the thing to do is to press forward towards full victory. And as I pointed out in his last Telegram post, he was openly advocating, though in coded language, decapitation strikes against the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev. Putin did not go as far as Medvedev did, but as I also discussed in my program yesterday, he made his anger and disgust quite clear over the course of his press conference, and the extent of that was obvious from his continuous avoidance throughout the press conference of Donald Trump's name, use of Donald Trump's name. As I've explained, that is something that Putin does, that Russians, by the way, tend to do when they strongly disapprove, when they are unable any longer, when they want to signal their disgust with the actions of the person that is being alluded to. So Russians will have read and understood this, and this is undoubtedly the signal that Putin was trying to convey. So what Witkoff and Dmitriev and what the various other people who Witkoff meets are going to be able to cobble together over the next couple of days or weeks is open to serious doubt. I am not sure that, given the mistrust that now exists and the widespread view in Moscow that Trump at best is an indecisive and weak leader who is unable to see agreements through, I am far from convinced, I'm far from sure that this is going to be cobbled together again. But at least someone is trying. And maybe that is something that, well, I personally am grateful for, though I know there will be many, many others who think that even trying to maintain a dialogue between Russia and the United States in light of what has just happened is a mistake. Anyway, we will see what comes, and we will see whether anything is put together. For the record, Dmitriev, from what I've been able to see, is not deviating by one iota from the official Russian position. He has said that there is an agreement on the table, or at least something that could be used as a framework towards an agreement. I've already said that I think something like that may have been discussed between Putin and Trump in Alaska. The problem is that Trump has never come back to the Russians to make clear what his stance on that agreement, if it exists, actually is. And the fact that he cannot do that suggests that this framework that Dmitriev is talking about, and which the Russians have previously talked about, Lavrov and Putin have previously talked about, is one that the Ukrainians and the Europeans and the hardliners in the United States vehemently oppose, which strongly suggests that it is something very close and perhaps even identical to Istanbul Plus, to what Putin outlined to the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June last year. Anyway, so Dmitriev has referred to that. He has, however, said that a temporary ceasefire is out of the question. He has said that neutrality for Ukraine, cast iron neutrality for Ukraine, is a must. He does say that security guarantees for Ukraine are by no means excluded, but then of course that is also there in Istanbul and in Istanbul Plus. That does not deviate in any way from the Russian position. And he says that it goes beyond questions of territory, it goes the conflict, the issues of the conflict, the root causes of the conflict extend to many other issues, rights of Russians and that kind of thing. But I've no doubt that demilitarization, denuclearization, denazification, all of those things that the Russians have talked about, and which, by the way, appear to have been largely agreed by the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul, that still, as far as the Russians are concerned, remains absolutely on the table and will not be taken off it. So it doesn't seem to me, in fact, I could say absolutely, based on what I have heard and seen Dmitriev say, that he is deviating from the Russian position, and he's trying to explain that to the Americans, and he's doing that in faultless English, and sometimes, as I said, by giving interviews to the American media as well. Whether this will lead to anything is another matter. About one thing I am confident, which is that it will not lead to anything anytime very soon. We are on the brink of a potential meeting, a likely meeting between President Trump of the United States and President Xi Jinping of China. The meeting is due to take place within the next couple of days in South Korea. Trump appears to have, again, over high, I would say exaggerated expectations of this meeting, judging from the various things that he's saying to the American media. Trump has a habit of doing this. He has this strange idea that if he meets with people like Putin and Xi, all the problems will somehow dissolve away, overwhelmed by the force of his personality. His Russian and Chinese interlocutors will fold and agree to his every demand. He's made the same mistake with Prime Minister Modi of India. Anyway, he's going through all that all over again. He's even talking about trying to enlist the help of the Chinese to settle the conflict in Ukraine on his own terms. All I would say is good luck with that. The Chinese have repeatedly made it clear to every conceivable Western official that they've spoken to in the past that that's not happening. And I have no doubt at all that that is exactly what is going to be said to Trump on this issue by Xi Jinping. That the Chinese are in no mood to make concessions on anything substantial is indicated by what has happened in the interactions between China and Germany. The German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul was due to visit China to meet Chinese officials. He was hoping to meet Wang Yi. He was clearly also hoping to meet more other officials in China as well. Conceivably, he wanted to meet Xi Jinping. The Chinese said no, and Wadephul has accordingly decided to call off the whole visit. He understands that he's not going to make any big impression in China. The Chinese, incidentally, and for the record, are furious with the Europeans at this particular time. They're furious with the European Union and with the European governments. They are extremely angry about the seizure of Expedia, the company based in the Netherlands. It's a Dutch registered company, but it was under Chinese ownership, and it had a Chinese management, and of course that company was in the business of producing billions of low-end chips, most of the low-end chips that are used by the German auto industry, for example. And apparently, under pressure from the United States, the Dutch authorities basically walked into the offices of this company, sacked the Chinese management, appointed Dutch managers, even though they claimed that they were not interfering with the property rights of the company. And it was the Chinese have responded, retaliated by basically blocking exports from China of the chips that this company makes, which in fact it turns out are mostly made in China. And there are reports that this is having a knock-on effect on the European car industry and on the American car industry as well, as it happens. Anyway, I don't expect the President of the United States is going to find the Chinese president in a particularly accommodating mood. He will find, as American interlocutors do, that the Chinese come up with carefully worded, extremely interesting lectures about win-win solutions and that kind of thing, all couched in elegant language from the Chinese, providing all kinds of philosophical and insightful thoughts. But when you drill behind the words, you find that despite the courtesy with which they are typically expressed by the Chinese, they never give way on anything. And I suspect that that is what Trump, when he meets Xi Jinping, is going to discover. Anyway, putting that aside, I cannot see myself how anything that is discussed by Dmitriev and Witkoff and Dmitriev and any other American officials, even if it leads to some kind of positive outcome, can be taken forward whilst Trump himself is tied up in all of these discussions when in Asia, his meetings with Xi Jinping and all of that. I have to say this, I don't think Trump's attention span extends that far, that he can be dealing with two of these very complicated interactions with two great powers at one and the same time. Here, to finish, I will also express my own view. It is highly likely that Rubio did play a significant role in wrecking the summit meeting between Putin and Trump, and in getting the United States, getting Trump himself to agree to impose the sanctions upon Russia. I agree entirely with the view that Rubio deep down is a neocon, even though he has learnt to speak MAGA when he needs to. I have heard many times that he, together with Kellogg and Waltz, form a hardline, hawkish faction within the United States government, which has always been advocating a much harder line against the Russians and probably the Chinese also than, say, people like Witkoff or Vance or others might have preferred. But ultimately, the decision must be one made by the President of the United States himself. And I get the impression that in the end, in the final analysis, it was Trump himself who made the big decisions over the last week. It was Trump who did not move forward with whatever it was that he and Putin thought they had agreed with each other in Alaska. Perhaps he didn't even understand fully that the Russians came away from Alaska believing that they had reached understandings and agreements with him. It was Trump who allowed the whole idea of the Tomahawk missile deployments to Ukraine to gain traction, and he spoke several times to the media, giving the distinct impression that the decision to supply or deploy the Tomahawks had already been made. It was Trump who decided, presumably, to give permission to Ukraine to conduct deep strikes inside Russia with drones, and allowed Ukraine, provided Ukraine with the intelligence to do that. It was Trump who, when confronted with all of this by Putin over the course of the telephone conversation they had about 10 days ago, instead of apparently giving any clear answers to Putin, suggested a summit meeting in Budapest instead. It was Trump who tried to bully Zelensky the following day into making concessions to Putin, such as might have made the summit meeting in Budapest worthwhile. And it was Trump, in my opinion, who seized on whatever advice he was given by Rubio following the call with Lavrov, of which all of the indications are that it went quite well. It was Trump who decided then that this provided him with an excuse to call off the meeting and humiliate Orban in the process and embarrass Putin, and who then went back on his agreements with Putin, said that he advocated a ceasefire after all, and who then wanted or sought to cover his retreat by declaring these sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. You can point the finger at Rubio, But as another US president, Harry Truman, once said, the buck stops here. It stops with the President of the United States. And to the extent that we have a diplomatic debacle, it is he who is at fault in this matter. And it is he now who, if this process is to be repaired, has to do the hard work to try to repair it with the Russians, which may very well be beyond his ability to do. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, other people are continuing to have their own discussions about Ukraine-related matters. The umpteenth meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, the enterprise that Macron and Starmer cobbled together last autumn. This is meeting again in London, and we are told by the British media that this time there is no discussion so much about how to enforce a ceasefire. This is no longer the plan, apparently. The plan instead, the purpose of the meeting is to try to find some further ways to put pressure on the Russians, supposedly to get them to the negotiating table, to force the Russians to agree to the unconditional ceasefire on the existing conflict lines, which is what the Europeans and the Ukrainians have now united behind ever since Trump first announced that he wanted a ceasefire back in February and March. The reality, of course, is that the Europeans have no leverage over the Russians whatsoever. They have announced that they're going to stop all gas imports, natural gas imports from Russia, LNG imports from Russia by 2027. That is a disastrous idea, which is going to only worsen the energy crisis in Europe. But of course, the Europeans are busy, have been busy for several years now, committing economic suicide. And the Russians are utterly contemptuous about that. We have seen that they have no weapons to supply to Ukraine. There's been a long article, by the way, in the Russian media that I read about the crisis in Western tank production, which is absolutely the case. The West barely produces tanks anymore. And as far as I can tell, deliveries of armoured vehicles to Ukraine has essentially stopped, and of artillery pieces also. So anyway, the Europeans have no real pressure against the Russians that they can exert. But never mind, you can still have meetings, you can still have Zelensky there, you can still hug him, as Prime Minister Starmer has done outside Downing Street, and have the photos appear showing it. You can still make speeches about how everybody in Europe and in the United States should agree to allow the Ukrainians to breach the Russian red line by conducting deep strikes inside Russia, which is of course what Prime Minister Starmer has also done. Of course, the British have no powers here. They can supply storm shadows to Ukraine, though these are apparently now in desperately short supply. In fact, I've heard that the British are down to giving the Ukrainians what they can produce, and that is only a handful each month, because these missiles are mostly made by hand. That's what I've heard. May not be true, but it is what I've heard. But even the Storm Shadows, which have only a limited range, can only be launched at targets in Russia if American assistance is provided, because they need American inputs to strike targets inside Russia where GPS doesn't work. This is confirmed in the British media last year. Now, here I'm going to come back to the topic of the Russian Red Line and of the missile strikes. As I said already, the Russians are going out of their way to say that the sanctions announcement by the United States does not cross a Russian red line. Long-range missile strikes, obviously by Tomahawks, but by any long-range missiles, that does cross a Russian red line. Now, a couple of days ago, there were reports, the Ukrainian General Staff themselves talked about this. There were reports that the Ukrainians and the British and the Americans had indeed conducted a missile strike inside Russia against a Russian chemical factory in the Russian city of Bryansk, which is located well within pre-2014 Russian territory. Now, if so, that would indeed appear to breach a Russian red line. Now, I have been waiting to see Russian confirmation of this, but it has never come. The Russian Defense Ministry spoke about shooting down 4 cruise missiles, but they never gave information about the identity of these cruise missiles. They could have been Storm Shadows, or they could have been Neptune missiles operated by Ukraine, or they could have been this new Flamingo missile that the Ukrainians have been showing, though apparently there are reports in the Ukrainian media that this missile has turned out to be a complete and utter flop. Ukraine cannot produce it in any numbers. Claims earlier that this missile was being produced and indeed was even operational or was close to being operational were untrue. That has turned out to be a complete fiction. Anyway, put that aside. The Russians referred to an attack by 4 cruise missiles. They might have been Ukrainian missiles. They didn't specify also against which targets those cruise missiles had been launched against. And I was waiting to see satellite photos of the factory in Bryansk and to see whether in fact it did actually suffer any damage. And well, maybe I've missed the photos and maybe they have appeared. All I would say is, again, of course, on this, I have very poor eyesight, as many people know, and I find it very, very difficult sometimes to look at photos of that kind, especially satellite photos, or make much sense of them myself. And given the difficulties in understanding these photos, I'm not going to pretend that I always look for them or look for them very much. But I have tried this time and I haven't seen them. And I notice that though there were a few commentaries in the British media about this strike having taken place, they all appear to be based on the initial report of the Ukrainian General Staff, and I haven't heard much more about it since. Now, I wonder whether the strike happened and perhaps it was unsuccessful, and that there's been a general agreement on the part of the Americans and the Russians that this will be a one-off and that this is a mistake and that it should not happen again, and that the Russians maybe over the course of the telephone conversation between Putin and Trump actually agreed that this would not happen again, and that there's been instructions, for example, to the satellite companies not to release the photos, which might confirm that the strike took place. Or, of course, it could be that the Ukrainians just made up the whole story. because they want to conduct missile strikes against Russia, and they are constantly lobbying for these missile strikes, and they want to give the impression that they are already taking place. And of course, Zelensky talks about this all the time. I don't know, and I would be interested to know, just saying. But anyway, for the moment, at least, the Russians are pretending, or perhaps they're right, that this strike never happened, and the West isn't saying much about it. Anyway, one way or the other, Starmer, of course, continues to advocate these missile strikes, and he hugs Zelensky, and Zelensky looks very happy to be in London and to be meeting with all of his friends. Now, nothing of substance is coming out of these meetings. These meetings serve no useful purpose except one, which is that they bring all of these leaders of Europe together in regular meetings. I remember many years ago reading J.K. Galbraith's brilliant book on the Wall Street crash of 1929, published in the 1950s. And Galbraith in that book referred to no business meetings, a concept of a no business meeting, that being a meeting where no business happens. The purpose of the meeting is not to conduct business, but to bring all of these important people together, or seemingly important people together, and by bringing them together to somehow convey the impression that these people are actually important. So these are indeed starting increasingly to look to me like no business meetings, Galbraith's no business meetings in that sense. But think of how completely surreal this is, because over the last 24 hours, there's been another big deterioration of Ukraine's situation on the front lines and in the sky. Last night, the Russians conducted another massive missile strike on Ukraine. They apparently targeted Kiev heavily. There are reports that they also attacked and seriously damaged another energy producing complex facility close to Kiev itself. I saw claims this morning, we'll see whether they turn out to be true, that there is likely to be a blackout in Kiev tonight, that Kiev in autumn, at a time when temperatures are falling, could again be without electric power tonight, without central heating, without energy. Well, we'll see whether that is so. All of this is happening whilst the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, prefers to attend a no-business meeting in London. He's there, he makes all kinds of defiant speeches. He makes his various, I find, deeply unfunny jokes. He clearly revels in all of this attention. I've said on many occasions that Zelensky appears to be much happier being outside Kiev and indeed Ukraine now than he is being in Kiev and Ukraine. And, well, here we have a further example. Bear in mind that travel to and from Kiev is never easy. Zelensky has to travel by train or car to leave Kiev, and he has to drive or travel on his train all the way to the Polish border. And then he has to get, presumably, on a flight to go to London or wherever it is he wants to go. So you would have thought that given the difficulties of travel from Ukraine and given the situation in Ukraine and given the utter emptiness, sterility, in my opinion, of these meetings, of these endless European no business meetings, it would make more sense for him to stay where he is needed as president of Ukraine and as the country's commander-in-chief, which is of course in Kiev itself. But no, he prefers to attend this no business meeting in London. And as for Prime Minister Starmer, well, his party has just suffered a catastrophic defeat in a formerly utterly secure constituency in Wales, one which the Labour Party has held since uninterrupted since, well, I believe over 100 years. And he's just had an internal election within his party, and one of his internal critics has now been one of his internal critics who just a few weeks ago he sacked from the British cabinet, has now been elected the party's deputy leader. And again, one would have thought, in advance of a critical budget, in the face of a critical political and economic situation, that he would be focused single-mindedly on that. But not at all. Not in any way. I'm not sure whether President Macron is in London, but I assume he is. There is reports circulating that his Prime Minister, Monsieur Lecornu, is due to face another crisis on Monday. The Socialist Party that's propping up his government in France is now demanding a wealth tax and say that they will withdraw support from the French government on Monday unless they get it. You would have thought that President Macron of France would be worried about that. After all, France's credit rating has again just been cut, and this is a serious matter given that France is running a massive budget deficit and has to borrow all the time on the financial markets in order to keep the deficit covered. But no, President Macron prefers to talk about putting pressure on the Russians, having discussions with Zelensky. One of his generals is talking about how France would be ready to send troops to Ukraine from next year, from 2026. These are the things that the European leadership are more focused on. And of course, they're also still agonizing and arguing with each other about how they're going to steal, seize, confiscate, or borrow against the Russian assets, the frozen Russian assets, which, like my friend and colleague Alex Christoforou, and as I have now been privately informed, the Russians themselves believe, have already been heavily pilfered. So they're arguing about that. The latest plan for a loan to be secured against these assets, a 140 billion euro loan, has been torpedoed principally by the Belgian government. The Belgian Prime Minister has been loudly complaining that this is almost certainly an illegal idea, which he's absolutely right about. He says that if it were implemented in its current form and there were legal judgments against Euroclear on the basis of that, it would be the Belgians, it would be Belgium which would have to carry the liability. he didn't say it, or at least I believe he didn't say it, but I'm told that if that were the case, and the entire liability were indeed to fall on Belgium, the cost would wipe out Belgium's entire budget. He's therefore insisted that other European states, all of the other European states, and he's basically said the Americans as well, who've also been pushing this idea, should give, at the very least, guarantees to Belgium to cover the cost of this scheme were it to go wrong. And of course the Europeans collectively, who, as I said, I'm more confident, have already been dipping their hands and helping themselves to some of this money, were not prepared to do that. They are content that Belgium should carry all the liability and the cost itself. And by the way, the Americans have openly signalled that they're not prepared to cover the cost of this either. So the result was that despite all expectations, despite all predictions, the European Council was unable to agree on this project, on this idea, when it convened the day before yesterday. Apparently, another person who spoke out strongly against this disastrous plan was the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. And again, I suspect what worried her was the whole idea of Italy taking on further liabilities. The very fact that people are taking on liabilities of this kind, worries about liabilities of this kind, emphasizes the point I have made repeatedly. When people who are about to do something illegal come up with schemes to conceal the fact of the illegality, all they are doing is telegraphing to any court that might be adjudicating the matter in future their knowledge of the illegality. And what, in effect, the European leaders were trying to do was that they were trying to play a game of musical chairs to put the blame, or the responsibility perhaps more accurately, on one of them, specifically on Belgium, where Euroclear happens to be based. It's a shabby enterprise, and it failed. No one should think that this, however, is the end of this particular story. I am confident that the Europeans, over the next few weeks, over the next few months, will come up with some new scheme. Apparently, the European Council and the European Commission have been informed that the ability to continue to support Ukraine from the existing EU budget has been exhausted. That unless extra sources of funding are found, financial aid for Ukraine must stop. If the European Union were to try to continue to support Ukraine from the EU budget for much longer, then the budget would run into deficit, and there would be a real possibility that the European Union itself might see its credit rating downgraded, which, given that the European Union is not a government with tax-raising powers, but is an extra national parastatal institution, would be catastrophic, because it might make it much more difficult for EU governments in that case to be able to advance funds to the EU to cover its budget, there might actually be legal constraints preventing them from doing so. Given, therefore, the absolute political imperative that support from the EU budget for Ukraine, the political imperative to do that, which still exists, and given that every EU country of any significance is now in budget difficulties of its own, so that extra funding from the governments to the EU is increasingly difficult. And of course, some of the EU countries, Germany for example, are already themselves providing direct funding to Ukraine. Some means of funding, unconventional funding, to keep this enterprise going must be found. And the only way to do it now appears to be by going after the frozen Russian assets, or at least that part of the frozen Russian assets that is still left. So, be under no doubt, over the next couple of weeks, some step will be taken. In some way, they will screw up the courage to do this disastrous thing, and they will take the step of seizing them. They will find some way to do it. I don't know what it is, because after all, given that we're discussing something which is illegal, I am not able, and I'm absolutely not going to discuss any illegal enterprise myself of that kind. So anyway, there we go. That's what the Europeans are up to. The Russians, meanwhile, as I said, continue the war. They conducted that massive drone and missile strike against Ukraine last night that I've just spoken about, and the attack on the energy complex near Kiev was only one of the targets. We're getting much more news now from the battle lines, and it is becoming increasingly grim. Firstly, and most importantly, the ring around Pokrovsk, or at least the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, is now tightening fast. The Russian Defense Ministry has not yet confirmed the fact, but it does look as if, definitely now, the town of Rodinska, immediately to the north of Pokrovsk, has fallen, that the Russian army controls Rodinska and controls a large belt of territory around Rodinska itself, including the crossroads, the famous crossroads, where the video footage appeared last week of the Ukrainian vehicles that were trying to reach Pokrovsk, the skeletons of those vehicles that had been destroyed by the Russian drones. It looks as if those roads, that road complex, that crossroads, has now been reached and occupied by the Russian army itself, so that road access to Pokrovsk is effectively cut off. It looks as if the Russians control all the major slag heaps or terracons of the various mines in this area. They have undoubtedly, indisputably captured the Krasno-Limansky mine, and it looks as if they've also captured the Dmitrov mine located in Mirnograd itself. There is good reason to think from video footage that the Russians now control significant territory within Mirnograd itself, probably the north, probably most of the north of Mirnograd also. And there are further reports that the Russians not only have crossed the railway lines in Pokrovsk and perhaps have occupied the industrial area northwest of Pokrovsk, but that they've advanced further and that they are out from Pokrovsk and that they are outside the village of Grishino, located to the northwest of Pokrovsk, which is also located along the main roads. Anyway, there are reports, I've discussed them already, I discussed them yesterday, that the Russians have given a deadline to the Ukrainians which expires on Monday, either to lay down their arms in Pokrovsk or to evacuate, presumably under some kind of safe conduct, from Pokrovsk. That the situation in Pokrovsk is now at crisis, and that there is going to be, over the next couple of hours probably, a major Russian decision on how to end this battle of Pokrovsk, has been signalled for me by the very latest piece of information that's come from Pokrovsk. This is that General Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces and the overall commander of Russian forces conducting the special military operation, has himself come to Pokrovsk. This has been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry. He is there. There's even pictures of his helicopter, which has arrived in the area. He's having meetings with the commander of Group of Forces Center, which is the force, the Russian force tasked with capturing Pokrovsk, and he's also meeting with low-ranking commanders. It looks as if the Battle of Pokrovsk, one way or the other, is about to end, and that Gerasimov is there to assess the situation and to give any final instructions. And elsewhere, the situation for Ukraine is also very grave. We now have drone footage of a Ukrainian attack, provided by the Ukrainians, of a Ukrainian attack on a position, a Russian position, inside the city of Konstantinovka, which is, of course, the big city located to the east of Pokrovsk. That location turned out to be far deeper inside Konstantinovka than anybody, including, by the way, the Russian General Staff, had placed the Russians before. It looks as if the Russians are indeed well inside, deep inside Konstantinovka now, and one suspects that the crisis for the Ukrainians is growing as well. The Russians are apparently now beginning their storming operation of the town of Liman, west of Slavyansk, and according to Radovka, they're also planning to capture the other town of Svyatogorsk, which is located a little to the west, closer to Slavyansk, which the Russians, by the way, also for a time held in 2022, and which incidentally is an important religious center with an important Russian Orthodox monastery located there. Anyway, the noose on Slavyansk is tightening. The Russians appear to be preparing to attack Liman. There are reports that there are just 3 Ukrainian battalions, 1,500 men in total, if those battalions were fully up to strength, which of course they're not, trying to defend Liman. Probably the true number of Ukrainian troops in Liman is counted in the hundreds rather than the thousands, just saying. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, with the fall of Dronivka, the village to the west of Siversk, that town, Siversk, the garrison there, is now also essentially cut off. And, well, there is now lots of drone footage which shows heavy Russian bombing of Kherson city, and it's clear again to me at least, that some kind of operation is taking place there, which I'm not going to discuss. The Russians also appear to be continuing their advance in Zaporozhye region. I read recently, yesterday, a long discussion of the military situation provided by a Russian military commentator called Sergei Poletayev, which basically gives a fairly detailed overview of the battle. I'm not going to go over it. All I would say is that Poletayev made 2 points, one of which perhaps is contestable, but nonetheless interesting. The other is very striking. He said that as a result of combat losses, but also even more mass desertion, the Ukrainian army is shrinking every month by around 15,000 men. It cannot keep pace with its shrinkage because mobilization in Ukraine is falling far below that number. Whereas Russia continues to be able to replace its losses, it continues to recruit at a rate of around 40,000 men a month. Obviously, there is a constant churn, but the Russians, because they're fighting with volunteers, do not experience the same kind of problem of desertion as the Ukrainians do. He says that there is, as a result, for the Ukrainians, a critical shortage of infantry right across the front lines. And Maria Berlinskaya, a Ukrainian commentator, but also activist, who is very, very close to the Ukrainian soldiers, is saying exactly the same thing, that Ukraine is suffering from a critical shortage of infantry. It can no longer plug the holes in the front lines. And probably that is what the Russians are taking advantage of in Kherson. That is a contestable claim, the contestable claim that Poletayev is making. The incontestable one, which he cites as proof that the Ukrainian army is now in deep decline, is one which I admit had never occurred to me, but which is indisputably true. This is the first year, 2025, has been the first year in which Ukraine, throughout the entire period of the war, has failed to conduct a ground offensive. In 2022, it conducted its ground offensives from August to October in Kharkiv and in Kherson region. In 2023, from June until October, it conducted its catastrophically unsuccessful, indeed disastrous offensive in the south towards the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. And in 2024, it conducted its equally catastrophic and equally unsuccessful offensive in Kursk region. This year, 2025, despite urgings at various times from President Zelensky and from the Ukrainian military chief, General Syrskyi, the Ukrainians have been unable to conduct any ground offensives at all. They have attempted instead to attack Russia in the sky with drones. I've discussed in many places how this has failed to have anything like the kind of impact that many people in the West appear to believe. And obviously it also explains why Ukraine has been agitating and demanding help to conduct long-range missile strikes inside Russia itself, because it cannot take the war to the Russians in the way that it did in the previous three years of the war by launching counteroffensives against them, ground offensives against them. And given the personalities of Zelensky and Syrskyi and the political imperative for Ukraine of launching offensives of that kind, one can see that that does indeed underline the extent to which the Ukrainian military is indeed in a state of decline. I mentioned Belinskaya. She actually spoke about the front lines bursting, that the Russians were piling up the pressure constantly, everywhere, in every place. We see, as I said, that they've started new operations in Kherson region. Difficult to understand fully exactly what is going on there. And by the way, in Kharkiv region, it looks as if the Russians are also again on the attack. And I've even heard one report that something is being prepared by the Russians in Sumy region as well. But certainly in the key front lines in Donbass, in Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, and in the areas around Slavyansk, the towns around Slavyansk, Kupiansk, Siversk, Liman, the crisis is growing, and Berlinskaya's comment about the front lines bursting is increasingly looking like it might be true. Well, that's what I want to say about the conflict in Ukraine. Today, it seems to me again that the Americans, at least, the President of the United States, perhaps doesn't fully understand that the time window for serious negotiations is closing fast, that before long the Russians will indeed be in control of Donbass, and at that point the Ukrainians and that the Western powers will have significantly less to negotiate about if a trade between Donbass and other territory was ever the issue. And of course, probably the President of the United States still doesn't understand the massive damage he's done to his negotiation efforts over the last 2 weeks, even though it does seem as if perhaps some members of his administration do have an inkling of it. Anyway, even as he's flying to confront, or perhaps more accurately, to be confronted by Xi Jinping, he is preparing a new war in another place. We now have reports that a US Navy carrier is steaming towards the Caribbean to join the enormous task force, American task force, that has already positioned itself in the Caribbean in preparation for some kind of attack on Venezuela. And the President of the United States has now followed that up by imposing sanctions upon the President of Colombia, a neighboring Latin American country. I would say that Colombia, incidentally, and for the record, has been historically America's most loyal friend in Latin America. It's consistently had pro-American governments for as long as I can remember. The current president is a little different, but I don't believe that he is really an adversary of the United States. But it looks as if the President of the United States wants to regime change him as well. Meanwhile, he is throwing tens of billions of dollars of American taxpayers' money to prop up his other friend in Latin America, President Milei of Argentina. $20 billion of emergency relief provided by the United States government. Apparently, there's going to be another $20 billion also provided by the United States government. And it looks as if some of the major US banks have also been strong-armed to provide another $20 billion as well. President Milei, of course, has already had $40 billion provided to him by the International Monetary Fund earlier this year, and I believe there have been other big transfers of funds to Argentina as well. None of that is preventing President Milei burning through all these billions of dollars at astonishing speed as he tries to prop up the peso, the Argentine currency, at the present unsustainable levels. Well, maybe to some people this is less serious than the fairly blatant regime change operations that are being prepared in Venezuela and Colombia. In Venezuela, the president has basically now indicated that the United States might indeed conduct ground operations. I never had any doubt. And if you actually parse his words carefully, which perhaps with Donald Trump it is unwise to do, I think that the same could stretch to cover Colombia as well. And indeed even Mexico, because he's talking about pursuing the drug cartels on land as well as by sea. Whether any of this really assists the United States, well, I would argue absolutely not. Entirely the opposite is true. I'm not going to talk about Venezuela, but I will say this about Colombia, which is a country I've never visited, but know a fair amount about its history. It might surprise the president himself, and it might surprise many people in the United States, but many of the people in Colombia who historically have been involved in the kind of activities that the president is currently objecting to have historically been America's allies and friends. Anyway, we will now have to wait and watch as all that plays out, even as the war in Ukraine continues to be lost and the United States drifts ever closer into a major economic confrontation with China as well. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please do remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.